Frank Miller was 68 years old, a man whose life had fallen into quiet repetition since the day his wife, Sarah, passed away. For the last 3 years, his mornings never changed. Coffee at 6, the newspaper on his porch at 6:30, and by 7 o'clock, he was out the door with his worn fleece jacket zipped up against the cold Massachusetts wind. His footsteps carried him down Mitchell Street, the same route he and Sarah had once walked together when autumn leaves carpeted the sidewalks and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Now it was just him, the steady tap of his cane on the pavement, and the occasional polite wave from neighbors who had long stopped inviting him to Sunday dinners. They meant well, but sympathy could not fill the hollow spaces she had left behind. Frank didn't mind. He had built a wall of silence around himself, and in some ways it felt safer that way. Each morning he pulled the jacket tighter across his chest, not only to shield against the sharp wind, but also to brace against the heavier chill of loneliness. On that Wednesday, everything appeared to follow its usual rhythm, until an unfamiliar sound sliced through the stillness and forced him to stop mid-stride. At first, Frank thought it might have been the wind, sharp and restless as it tore through the empty streets, but then it came again, louder this time, raw and desperate. His heart kicked against his chest. That wasn't the wind. It was a cry, high-pitched and jagged, carrying the kind of terror that made the skin prickle along the back of his neck. For a split second he wondered if it was human, but then his stomach dropped as realization struck. It was a dog's cry, guttural and panicked, like an animal fighting against the edge of survival. Somewhere further down, a woman's voice broke through the morning air, urgent and shaking. "Help, somebody please help." Without thinking, Frank's feet were already moving, his routine forgotten as he turned off Mitchell Street and hurried toward Oak Street. The closer he got, the more distinct the commotion became, a low rumble of voices, gasps from a gathering crowd. When he reached the corner, the sight that met him rooted him to the spot. A small cluster of neighbors stood frozen at the base of the Thompson house, their eyes fixed upward, horror etched into their faces. Frank followed their gaze and felt his breath catch. Dangling from the second-story roof was a large German shepherd, its front paws clawing frantically at the gutter, while a heavy chain dragged it closer to the edge with every desperate movement. For a moment, Frank couldn't move. The scene above him was so unreal that his mind struggled to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The German shepherd dangled like a pendulum, its chain scraping against the house siding, metal clinking with every swing. The dog's chest heaved in frantic bursts, its claws screeching against the gutter as if begging the building itself for mercy. One slip, one falter, and the weight of the chain would drag it down to the concrete below. A woman in the crowd pressed a hand to her mouth, her voice trembling. "We called 911, they said it'll be 15 minutes. The fire department's tied up on the highway. 15 minutes. Frank's eyes stayed locked on the animal. He could see the raw skin around its neck where the chain had rubbed it raw, the dullness of its coat, ribs visible beneath the fur. The shepherd let out another piercing cry, weaker this time, its back legs kicking at the empty air. It didn't have 15 minutes. "Where's Thompson?" Frank demanded, his voice sharper than he'd heard it in years. "Inside," someone muttered bitterly. "Probably passed out drunk, been hearing that poor dog crying all night." Frank's jaw tightened. He knew about James Thompson's drinking, the whispers about neglected animals, the quiet complaints no one had been able to prove. Now the proof was hanging right there, fighting for its life. Without another word, Frank shrugged off his jacket and pushed through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the crumbling colonial house. Frank's breath clouded in the cold morning air as he rounded the side of the house. The wood siding was faded and cracked, the kind of neglect that mirrored the stories neighbors had whispered about for years. His eyes found the open second-story window just a few feet from where the dog dangled, a gap in the frame that must have been its desperate escape route. Beneath it ran a narrow strip of decorative molding, weathered but still intact. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. "Frank, don't," Mrs. Reynolds called from the crowd, her voice tight with panic. "Wait for the fire department, you'll kill yourself up there." Frank didn't slow. "That dog won't make it 15 minutes, he shot back, his tone clipped, unshaken. He reached the base of the wall, tested the molding with one hand. It groaned under the pressure, threatening to splinter, but held. He pulled himself up, muscles screaming in protest. It had been years since he had done anything more strenuous than gardening, but adrenaline lent him strength. Hand over hand, he inched higher, his cane forgotten, his jacket abandoned in the frost-dusted grass. Below, the crowd held its breath as the old man scaled the side of the house, his figure small against the weathered boards. The German shepherd's eyes locked onto him, wide, frantic, but clinging to the sight of someone coming closer. Hold on, boy, Frank muttered through gritted teeth, voice steady though his heart hammered in his chest. Just hold on. Frank's fingers closed around the window frame, the wood cold and splintered beneath his grip. With a grunt, he hauled himself onto the narrow ledge that stretched just beneath the window, his boots scraping against the fragile molding. The German Shepherd was only 6 feet away now, its paws slipping again and again on the gutter's slick metal. Each slip sent a fresh rattle through the chain, each cry slicing through the morning air like a blade. Frank edged sideways, pressing his shoulder against the siding to steady himself. The ledge creaked ominously under his weight, and he forced himself not to look down. Easy now, he said softly. His voice meant as much for himself as for the dog. The shepherd's eyes found his, wide and desperate, but there was something else buried there too, hope faint but alive. Just as Frank reached out, the dog's front claws lost their final grip. With a screech of metal against metal, the shepherd plunged downward. No, instinct surged through Frank's veins. He lunged, one hand locking onto the chain as it whipped past him. The sudden weight yanked his arm nearly from its socket, dragging his body against the frame so hard the breath shot from his lungs. For a terrifying second, he thought the ledge would give way and send them both crashing to the ground. Below, the crowd gasped, someone screamed, but Frank held on, teeth clenched, muscles burning. "I've got you," he rasped, his knuckles white around the links. "I've got you, boy." Inch by inch, he began pulling, the chain slick with morning dew, his palms raw with pain. The shepherd kicked weakly, scrambling until its paws finally scraped against the ledge beside him. With a desperate push, Frank dragged the animal onto the narrow platform. For a heartbeat, man and dog stood trembling side by side, pressed against the crumbling wall, both alive, both shaken. Frank steadied the trembling shepherd against the siding, one hand still wrapped around the cruel chain biting into its neck. The dog pressed into him, chest heaving, but it made no move to flee or snap. Instead, it leaned closer, as though it understood that this stranger was its lifeline. Frank reached for the open window, guiding the animal inside to the dust-choked room beyond. He had just swung a leg over the sill when the sharp crash of breaking glass erupted below. Shouts followed, slurred, angry, and unmistakable. James Thompson had awakened. "What the hell are you people doing on my property? That's my dog." His voice cracked with rage, thick with alcohol. The shepherd flinched violently, ears pinned back, body shaking so hard Frank instinctively stepped in front of it, shielding it with his frame. "It's all right," Frank murmured firmly, though his own pulse thundered in his ears. "He won't hurt you anymore." From outside, sirens cut through the shouting, growing louder by the second. The crowd parted as two police cruisers skidded to a halt at the curb, their lights painting the house in red and blue. An animal control van followed close behind. "Mr. Thompson," a commanding voice rang out. "We've had multiple reports of animal abuse. Step back from the house." Thompson's protest was drowned by the crowd, who shouted their own accusations, their anger finally given voice. Frank exhaled shakily, keeping his palms steady on the dog's back. Help had arrived, but the fight for this animal was only beginning. Heavy boots pounded up the stairs, and moments later 2 police officers appeared in the doorway, their hands poised on their belts. Behind them, an animal control officer stepped forward, a catch pole ready in her grip. The shepherd pressed tighter against Frank's side, trembling so hard he could feel it through his own chest. "Sir, are you all right?" one of the officers asked. Frank nodded, keeping his voice calm. "We're both okay, but this dog needs medical attention right now." The animal control officer hesitated, her eyes flicking to the dog. "He could be dangerous," she warned, lifting the pole. Before she could move closer, Frank shook his head sharply. "He's not dangerous. He's terrified. Look at him." As if understanding, the shepherd sank onto its haunches beside him, panting hard but making no move to bite or growl. The officer lowered the pole, exchanging a glance with the police before pulling a pair of bolt cutters from her kit. She knelt carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. "All right, let's get that chain off." Frank kept one hand steady on the dog's chest as the cutters snapped through the heavy links. The chain clattered to the floor, and for the first time the shepherd stood unbound. The wounds on his neck were raw and ugly, patches of fur rubbed away to reveal angry red skin. The officer sucked in a sharp breath. "This is going to need documentation," she muttered grimly, raising her phone to take photos. But Frank wasn't listening. The dog hadn't bolted for the open door, hadn't turned on anyone in the room. Instead, it leaned into his leg, trembling but rooted in place. Frank felt the weight of it against him, fragile yet fierce, and something inside his chest shifted. For the first time in years, the wall of silence around his life cracked just enough to let something else in. Downstairs, the sound of shouting rose again, followed by the unmistakable click of handcuffs. Thompson's voice slurred through the walls, angry and defiant as officers led him out to the waiting cruiser. His protests faded beneath the steady hum of the crowd outside. In the bedroom, the shepherd remained pressed against Frank, as though afraid the world might rip him away again if he stepped too far. The animal control officer crouched nearby, her tone gentler now. "He'll have to come with us," she explained, slipping the broken chain into an evidence bag. "The vet will examine him, and he'll stay at the shelter until the case against Thompson is resolved." Frank's stomach tightened. A shelter cage, after everything this animal had endured, it felt like another sentence. He glanced down at the dog, who lifted its eyes to his with a look that was equal parts fear and plea. "How long will that take?" he asked quietly. The officer sighed. "Could be weeks, could be months, but with this much evidence and that many witnesses, I'd say Thompson's days of owning animals are finished." Frank hesitated only a moment before the words spilled out. What if I took him, just until things are settled, foster care, a safe place until he's free for adoption?" The officer studied him carefully, her expression softening. "You'd need to fill out paperwork and we'd check your home. But given what we all witnessed today," she trailed off, then nodded. "I think we could make it happen." For the first time in years, Frank felt something stir inside him that he had nearly forgotten existed: hope. He looked down at the battered dog leaning against him and spoke softly, almost to himself. "Don't worry, boy, you're not going back to that house, not ever again." 3 days later, Frank pulled into his driveway with the German shepherd in the back seat, a bandage still wrapped around the raw wounds on his neck. The shelter staff had given him a temporary name, Duke, and cleared him for foster care after his initial exam. He was underweight, his coat dull, but his eyes were brighter than the day Frank had first seen him clinging to that gutter. Frank had spent those 3 days preparing the house. He bought food bowls, bedding, and a sturdy leash. He'd even rearranged the furniture in the living room to make space for a dog bed near the couch, though he suspected Duke would want to stay close to him instead. When he opened the car door, Duke hesitated before stepping out, his nose twitching as he took in the unfamiliar scents of the yard. Frank waited patiently, his hand resting lightly on the leash. "Come on, boy," he said gently. "This is home now." Mrs. Reynolds emerged from next door carrying a wrapped package. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Duke," she said softly, careful not to startle him. "I baked some homemade treats for him and a casserole for you, Frank." Frank felt his throat tighten. It had been years since anyone had left something warm and thoughtful on his porch. "Thank you, Helen," he managed, voice rough with emotion. That night, Duke paced the house restlessly, starting at every unfamiliar sound. Frank finally stretched out on the couch, close enough to reassure him. Sometime in the dark hours, he felt a weight settle across his legs. When he opened his eyes, Duke had curled against him, his head resting lightly on Frank's knee. Frank exhaled slowly, one hand finding the dog's ears. "Good boy," he whispered, and for the first time in a long while, he slept without the familiar ache of emptiness pressing on his chest. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, not the lonely routine Frank had known for years, but something new, something alive. Each morning he clipped the leash onto Duke's collar and together they walked the same streets he had once traveled alone. At first Duke moved with caution, his head low, ears flicking at every sudden sound. Loud noises made him flinch. The sight of a strange man approaching too quickly sent him cowering behind Frank's legs. But little by little he began to change. His tail wagged tentatively when neighbors stopped to greet him, his nose pressed curiously into patches of grass he had passed without interest before. Frank found himself talking more, not just to Duke, but to the people who paused to admire the dog's progress. Mrs. Reynolds invited him for coffee again, and this time he accepted. At the dog park, other owners struck up conversations, and Frank realized how long it had been since he had spoken so freely. Duke's wounds healed faster than his fears, but trust grew between them. He learned that food would always be waiting, that the door would always open when he needed out, that no one would strike him for barking or simply existing. Frank watched as the dog's confidence bloomed, and in that steady transformation, something inside himself began to shift as well. He smiled more, he lingered longer on his walks. He even found himself whistling once, a sound he hadn't made in years, and the realization startled him. It was as if by teaching Duke how to live again, he had started to relearn the lesson himself. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and paper, its silence broken only by the shuffle of feet and the occasional cough. Frank sat in the second row, his hands folded tightly together, the weight of anticipation pressing heavier than the cane at his side. Duke wasn't allowed inside, but Frank could feel his presence all the same, waiting with an animal control officer just beyond the heavy double doors. At the front, James Thompson stood slouched between his lawyer and the bailiff, his face pale but defiant. The charges against him were read aloud: multiple counts of animal cruelty, violation of city ordinances, possession of unlicensed animals. Witness after witness stepped forward: neighbors who had heard the cries, officers who had seen the condition of the house, the animal control officer who documented Duke's wounds. When the photographs of the chain marks around Duke's neck were displayed on the screen, a murmur of disgust rippled through the room. Thompson shifted uneasily, his earlier bravado faltering. Frank's chest tightened as the prosecutor spoke of years of neglect, of cruelty hidden behind closed doors, of a dog that had nearly died because no one had acted sooner. The judge's gavel struck like thunder when the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts. Thompson was sentenced to jail time, fines, and a lifetime ban on owning animals. Frank closed his eyes, relief washing over him in a wave he hadn't expected to feel so deeply. The sound of the gavel still echoed when he stepped into the hallway, and there was Duke, tail thumping hesitantly against the floor the moment he saw him. Frank knelt, running a hand through the coarse fur. "It's over," he whispered. "You're free now, boy, free for good." In the weeks after the trial, life settled into something Frank had never imagined for himself at 68. Busy, connected, purposeful. With Thompson gone and Duke officially released from legal hold, the shelter staff fast-tracked the adoption. When Frank signed the final papers, his hands trembled, not with doubt, but with the weight of something that felt like starting over. Duke was no longer a foster, he was family. Together, they began to weave themselves into the fabric of the community. Morning walks turned into conversations with neighbors, who now stopped not only to pet Duke, but to check in on Frank as well. Children gathered at the end of the block, eager to hear the story of how the old man next door had climbed a roof to save a life. Their parents used it as a lesson. Compassion isn't optional, courage comes in many forms. Frank and Duke also found their way back to the shelter, but not as clients. They became volunteers. Duke, once broken and fearful, proved to have a calming effect on other abused dogs. His quiet presence soothed the nervous ones, coaxed the shy ones out from corners, showed them that trust was possible again. Watching him, Frank felt the ache of Sarah's absence soften, replaced by a steady warmth he hadn't thought he would feel again. Then came the invitation from the Humane Society. Frank and Duke were to be honored at the annual gala. Duke would receive the Hero Dog of the Year award for his work with other rescues, and Frank would be recognized for his unwavering dedication. On the night of the event, Frank stood at the podium, Duke at his side wearing a small bow tie someone from the shelter had insisted he needed. Looking out over the sea of faces, volunteers, families, donors, Frank cleared his throat. "When I climbed that roof," he said, his voice low but steady, "I thought I was saving one life. I didn't realize that life would end up saving mine too." The applause that followed was thunderous, but all Frank felt was the steady weight of Duke leaning against his leg, solid, alive, and unshakably his. Winter settled slowly over Cedar Grove, dusting the rooftops and sidewalks with pale frost. Frank had grown used to the sound of Duke's paws on the floorboards, the soft jingle of his collar, the steady presence that filled the house Sarah once kept so alive. One evening, after a long walk through the park, Frank sat on the back porch with Duke sprawled at his feet, his fur gleaming under the porch light. The dog's scars were still faintly visible beneath the healthy coat, but they no longer told a story of pain, they told one of survival. Frank rested a hand on Duke's head, his voice low, as though speaking to someone just out of sight. "Sarah would have loved you," he murmured. "She always said love was the best medicine for a broken heart. I think she would be proud of us both." Duke's tail thumped gently against the porch, and somewhere inside the house, the little calico cat they had taken in hope batted at a toy, her bell chiming in the quiet night. The neighborhood had grown closer too, no longer strangers but friends, drawn together by a story that began on a crumbling rooftop and grew into something larger than any of them expected. Frank smiled, feeling the warmth of the dog pressed against his leg, and for the first time in years, the even warmer weight of purpose in his chest. Sometimes salvation came on four paws. Sometimes the act of reaching out to save another life was what saved your own. And sometimes, Frank thought as he scratched behind Duke's ears, the best endings came disguised as desperate beginnings. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who believes in second chances, because you never know who needs to hear it today. And if you want more true-to-life stories of courage, compassion, and the bonds that change us, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next one. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too.